Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger with the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for April 9th, 2021. Today's Friday and I'll be taking some of the questions. I have to say I've gotten a lot of questions. I'm sorry I can't take all of them because there are some very good ones. But before I get to the questions, let me just begin with an update on what's happening with Ukraine. Yesterday, 2 days ago, the NATO military commander, Air Chief Marshal Sir Stuart Peach, went to Ukraine and met with the head of the military staff of Ukraine and also with President Zelensky. This comes as the Ukrainians have asked to be brought into NATO. This is a request from not a request, but an March 24th decree from President Zelensky, in which he said it's Ukraine's desire to bring Crimea back into Ukraine. Now, this was probably the trigger for moves back and forth and escalation of shelling, allegedly between both sides in the Ukrainian civil war. The moves and counter moves are very dangerous, as the front lines for the Ukrainian forces include some of the Nazi battalions, such as the Azov Brigade, the Banderistas, who have been incorporated into the Ukrainian military and security establishment. So this is mostly not reported in the West, but it goes back to the Maidan coup in February 2014, where the neo-Nazi units provided the muscle for the regime change coup that took place then. Now, the Biden administration has been sending somewhat strong statements about backing Ukrainian sovereignty, about opposing any Russian intervention. The Russians have shot back saying there's no Russian intervention. The Ukrainians are in a flight forward. It's a very dangerous situation because it puts the whole question of, once again, what was a question during the Cold War. If there would be an attack into Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO, but if the Russians were to attack Ukraine, what would NATO do? And some are saying that the Russians are pushing to see whether Biden will react. Others are saying the Ukrainians are pushing to see if they can get the Russians to back down. So this kind of potential nuclear chicken game is extremely dangerous and requires an intervention that would include a negotiation to go back to the Minsk agreement, which the Kiev government has refused to do. But I have written an article about this, which will be posted on the blog page of our website, probably sometime this weekend. Now, to get to the questions, most of the questions were of a strategic nature, which is I'm very happy to see. We'll start with actually 2 or 3 of you asked about what's going on with the U.S.-Iran talks. Is there a possibility for a new deal between the U.S. and Iran? What happened in Vienna when the JPCOA countries met with Iran and then separately with the United States? And what's the relationship of the Belt and Road Initiative to this and the Chinese discussion of a long-term treaty agreement of trading with Iran? And also, by the way, a possibility of an Iraq trade agreement with China. Well, the most important point here is that the only way to achieve a lasting peace in this region is going to be with reconstruction. This is a point that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has made repeatedly. This is at the core of the discussion of turning the Silk Road or the land bridge into a world land bridge, that you extend corridors of development into the Southwest Asia region, you reconstruct the war-torn areas. The wars were not the product of something local, but the intervention by outside forces. And I'm not just talking about George W. Bush in 2001 following 9/11, but go back to the 1980s. The Afghan operation was set in motion by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who intended to have an Islamic fundamentalist movement to undermine the Russians and the Chinese, what he called the soft underbelly of the Russian Empire, the Ark of Crisis. This goes back to the British Arabist Sir Bernard Lewis, who wrote extensively about how Islamic fundamentalism could be used as a weapon against Russia and China. And this is what we've seen going back to the Afghan war and the U.S. involvement in that when the Bush networks were involved in providing arms and logistical support to what became the bin Laden terrorist machine. So U.S. support for terrorists actually goes back, at least in the modern times, and by that I'm talking about from the 80s on, to the Afghan war, where we provided logistical support and weapons to the Afghansi forces that were fighting to kick the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. And when the Soviets left, they were still there, and their targets then became Western governments that stayed in Afghanistan. So if you wish to have a solution in the so-called Middle East or Southwest Asia, you have to start with a reconstruction. And the West is not going to do it alone, or probably at all, but we'll see about that. But the Chinese are willing to do it and are negotiating with Iran an oil for technology deal. There's a possibility for an oil for technology deal with Iraq. China needs the oil. These countries need the economic resources, including credit, financing. The United States said we will do nothing to rebuild Syria. The Biden administration, nothing to rebuild Syria until Assad is gone. Well, it was U.S. policy supporting the so-called moderate rebels which led to the Civil War, the bloodiest part of the Civil War, including the hundreds of thousands killed, the millions who were forced into refugee status, and now the U.S. sanctions are starving the Syrian people. Just as the Clinton administration's sanctions against Iraq in the 90s led to the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children, which then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said was a necessary consequence of Iraq's policy. So we see this pattern of the U.S. and the British conducting physical warfare, so-called kinetic warfare, psychological warfare, and economic warfare to destroy nations, particularly nations that don't accept the so-called rules-based order. And that's the targeting going on now of Russia and China. So to get to the question of this, there are negotiations going on between Iran and China. There are negotiations between Iraq and China. The Chinese have indicated their willingness to help in Syria, as have the Russians. So the question is, when will the United States get on board with this? If we truly want to ensure that there's not a recurrence of the buildup of terrorist networks in these countries, then lend a helping hand, participate in the reconstruction. And a starting point for this would be going back to an agreement with Iran, a nuclear deal. And look, there were probably some problems with the Iranian deal that was worked out under Obama. There were definitely problems. But by jumping out of it, what we created under Trump was a worse situation, which was largely dictated by the geopolitical interests of the British Empire, who used their puppets, Israel and Saudi Arabia, to drive the U.S. policy and to put us in a situation where it looked like for a period of time we would head to a war with Iran. Fortunately, President Trump had no intention to have a new war. So the question then is Joe Biden serious about resolving this situation? And if so, what kind of agreement would take place? And it would have to include a U.S. disengagement from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, it appears as though the Biden administration, at least at present, is committed to remaining in Afghanistan and Syria. So that's not a particularly good sign, although that could change. Now, a second question, will Glass-Steagall be re-implemented, or will the global bankers continue to destroy what's left of the U.S. productive economy? Well, that's what the fight over the Great Reset is about. The present situation in the financial system cannot last much longer. There's a buildup of unsustainable debt. In order to ensure that there's not a chain reaction of bankruptcies, the Federal Reserve is providing volumes of cheap credit, free credit in some cases, to the speculators. And what the speculators then do is they buy and sell stock. They buy and sell financial instruments of no actual determined value. The value for many of these instruments that are trading and the billions of trades each day is determined by the trades themselves, not anything of underlying value. That's the definition of a derivative, something that's derived from something of value, but has no value in itself. These are bets. That's why LaRouche called this a casino economy. As long as you have this unregulated banking system controlled by the coalition of global central banks, you're going to have a policy that will protect the speculators, protect the biggest risk takers, by guaranteeing that if their risks fail, they will be bailed out. And in the meantime, they're being bailed out by the quantitative easing, the repo markets, and so on, the purchase of bonds and stocks and mortgage-backed securities by the Federal Reserve. This is an insane policy. How long can it continue? Well, it's partly a psychological question, but not that much longer. And at the point at which it crashes, what's left of the physical economy will go down the tubes with it. So the idea of Glass-Steagall is a preemptive measure to ensure, first of all, that the commercial banking system will be sustained. That is, that it will be protected. Secondly, that there will be no bailout when these speculative investments crash. And that's the way we have to approach it. So Glass-Steagall is necessary. Will it happen? Well, that depends on you. That depends on the American people. It's not enough to sit around and complain about how bad the financial situation and the economy is. We need an active, educated citizenry to intervene. At one point, we had 115 or so congressmen supporting Glass-Steagall. President Trump included it in his platform in 2016, and that forced Hillary Clinton to include it in the Democratic platform. But no one did anything about it. If you want something done about this, we have to speak up, get educated, study what LaRouche's 4 laws are, because Glass-Steagall is the first step in implementing a sane economic policy based on LaRouche's 4 laws. Now, the final question, what about the moves to legalize marijuana? Chuck Schumer, Kamala Harris, many people, libertarians in the Republican Party, they're all saying, well, let's just legalize marijuana. Learn the lessons of history. Drugs are a tool of an imperial force that wishes to destroy the minds of the youth. Now, many of you said, well, I smoked pot when I was young and I can still think today. Well, look at the difference between the world in the 1950s and 60s and the world today. With all the problems we had with mutual and assured destruction, with the Cold War and so on, we were still building. We still had young people who were committed to the idea of a future. 50 years of the counterculture, and what has it produced? A generation that's hooked on social media, that's more interested in the thumbs up and thumbs down on their Instagram account than whether there are people starving in Africa, whether we have a plan to combat the COVID pandemic, whether we're about to go to war over Ukraine or over Afghanistan or over the Strait of Taiwan. The effect of drugs as part of a modern culture is absolutely unmistakable. The idea that it's a victimless crime is absurd. Now, this is one area where we can learn from the Chinese. The Chinese were subjected to 2 wars by the British Empire to force the population to be hooked on opium. And the Chinese will tell you today that part of the 100 years of the destruction of China stems from this decision of the British Empire to impose opium through the Opium Wars, in which opium dens were protected by the British Navy. And what was set up then in Hong Kong was a drug money center, a drug money laundering center, which continues to function to this day through banks such as HSBC, Bank of America, and so on, where you have many U.S. banks that continue to be involved in drug money laundering. Now, the arguments are that it's a victimless crime. Who does it hurt but the user? And if you legalize it, you cut out the money launderers. That's all nonsense. Those are talking points for an empire which is trying to convince nations to give up their future by allowing their young people and their middle-aged people, and in some cases older people, to indulge in mind-altering drugs. Now, people, LaRouche once said that pot smokers lose the brains that they had. It's important to recognize, if you look at this shift that's occurred from the post-World War II period to today, where we see apathy, we see indifference, we see terrible scores on competitive tests, when you compare the United States with South Korea or China or Japan, where you have this everything goes culture, do your own thing culture, in a culture of relaxation and enjoyment, and not of reality and physical production. We're losing the future. We're losing the morality needed to rally a population to reject this. So, as Aldous Huxley told us in The Brave New World, drugs are one of the weapons of choice for the oligarchy in dumbing down and destroying a population to make them submit to oligarchical rule. And so instead of looking at this as, well, aren't we entitled to a little pleasure? There's a big difference between pleasure rooted in an understanding of what it means to be human and making new discoveries, creative discoveries through classical culture, and the enjoyment one gets from contemplating the belly button lint in your stomach when you're on a marijuana high. So understand, this is not about personal freedom. It's about destroying personal freedom by destroying the ability of human beings to think creatively. That's what the drug culture was about. That's what the opium wars against China in the 19th century were about. And that's what the Opium War launched around the time of the Vietnam War in the United States was about. And if you look also at the youth suicide rates, you look at the number of people dying from overdoses, this is the consequence of having a soft-minded policy when it comes to marijuana legalization. And the fact that Chuck Schumer is behind it, and Kamala Harris is behind it, and the people who support casino speculation among the libertarians as so-called the free market policy are behind it, that should tell you something. Know your enemy and act against them. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back with you on Monday. Have a good weekend.